Hi, it's Anna Seawald, your host. During the month of August, I plan to take a short break from podcasting. However, the show will continue. I have selected some fantastic episodes from the past to air throughout August, and I hope you will enjoy my choices. Did you know that August is also the podcast's birthday month? Hooray! It was 9 years ago, on August 19, 2015, when I first created the podcast. It's hard to believe it's almost been a decade. We should definitely have a big celebration next year. Since 2015, Authentic Parenting has been a free resource helping thousands of people globally. The show has grown immensely, and I am incredibly grateful for your support. As we celebrate the 9th anniversary of the show, I invite you to show your love by making a donation. We rely solely on listener support, so your contributions are vital for keeping the show running. To see suggested amounts and make a contribution, visit authenticparenting.com/support. As a longtime listener, you probably know that Authentic Parenting also has a Patreon page where we have 21 amazing patrons supporting the show. I am deeply grateful for their contributions, but I encourage you to consider making direct donations as well. If you're hesitant to donate because you're wondering whether your contribution will make a difference, know that every dollar counts. There are many costs associated with producing the show, and your support makes a tremendous impact. We also understand that everyone's financial situation is different. If you're unable to donate at this time, know that we value every listener and appreciate your continued engagement with the show. Another way to show your support is by rating and reviewing the podcast on your preferred platform. It's super easy, it's quick, and it's free. Your ratings and reviews help increase the show's visibility, and that, my friend, is really important. Thank you from the bottom of my heart by being a listener, patron, and part of the Authentic Parenting community. This week's episode was first released last year, and it's one of my absolute favorites, highly practical and fun. Be sure to download the accompanying PDF with questions and exercises to enhance your listening experience. Please enjoy, and thank you for listening. I am Anna Seawald, and this is Authentic Parenting, a podcast about growing ourselves while raising our children. I'm a psychologist, educator, and parent coach. And on this podcast, I explore how you can connect to your authentic self, practice radical self-care, and raise emotionally healthy children. Let's break the generational cycle of trauma for a more peaceful, kind, and compassionate world. Today, uncovering your core values. Whether you're aware of your values or not, they guide you in how you live your life. If you can't necessarily pinpoint exactly what your values are, don't worry, you're not alone. And I hope this episode will help you to uncover your values through thoughtful questions and exercises. I am joined by Jen, one of my favorite listeners, a mother of 2 daughters, an active and valuable member of the Authentic Parenting community. Besides showing up and contributing to our bi-monthly support calls since March 2020, Jen has co-hosted a couple of episodes with me recently. She's super smart, funny, thoughtful, and has an incredible knowledge about AI. If you haven't listened to episode 380, Can you use AI in your parenting? I definitely encourage you to check it out. You'll be blown away by how she uses ChatGPT. You may ask, why should I care about values? Well, in short, discovering what your values are can increase your confidence and strengthen your decision-making skills because you've identified whether a decision aligns with your values or not. Knowing your values can guide your actions and give you inner peace. And who doesn't want inner peace? Your personal values are an essential part of who you are and who you want to be. And when how you live matches your values, life is usually good. You're aligned. You're more authentic. When your existence doesn't align with your personal values, that's when things feel wrong and you can feel unhappy. Discovering your values takes some time and self-reflection. This is why we're doing this episode, in which we talked about values versus needs, the role of values in parenting, when values conflict, the juicy peach metaphor, the importance of identifying and ranking our values, and what your childhood games and favorite toys have to do with your values. As I listened to Jen and learned more about her values, I started thinking how wonderful that we're different. I had a deep appreciation for diversity and being different. And one last thing, at the end, when I thanked Jen, I said, I feel so energized by our conversation today. And Jen said, really? Because I feel worn out and exhausted. We both laughed, and that's another difference that we discovered about one another. I hope you will feel energized, inspired, and uplifted by this episode. And most importantly, find it useful in discovering your own values. Please enjoy. Well, Jen, I am so excited to welcome you again on the podcast.
Yes, thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
I know. I love co-hosting this show with you. Today, we decided to talk about values. Values are pretty important. I think whether we are aware of them or not, they guide us, they help us make decisions. And when we're not aligned and when we make a decision, it feels icky, right? It feels a certain way, inauthentic. So that's when you know that you didn't make that decision based on your values. In my work, I always start with values when I work with a family or a client. So I have done, a lot of thinking, about values. I know my own core values, and I know you have done some work to uncover your own values as well. But I'm hoping today we can do some exercises and questions for both of us to uncover our own values, and most importantly, help the listener to come along and take some time to write, reflect on their own values, and use our questions and exercises as guidance for them.
Yes, I think that sounds like a good plan. And our values drive these decisions, whether we're mindful of our values or not, and how much better it is to be mindful of our values. And then we'll find that things just go along more smoothly when we have awareness of where we're coming from and where others are coming from. So I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, I think one important thing is then why values are so important. I think they make us feel more fulfilled, right? If we know what our values are, and when we make decisions, we are more confident, fulfilled, even happier. We have a conviction. We have a strength in us, right? We're more empowered when we are guided by our values. I think that sums up for me. How about for you?
I love the words you chose about being confident and having conviction, because again, when we aren't those things, when we don't have a clear view of what our values are and the decisions that we're making, you said icky too. It feels icky. It does. It feels like it's a wishy-washy sort of a thing. And is this the right thing to do? And I don't know. And we don't trust ourselves. And it's such a beautiful contrast to say, well, these are the things that I value, and the decision I make, is it in line with these values? Let me think and kind of count on your fingers. In what ways does it line up? And yes, when it does, we can confidently make that decision. And whether it turns out well or not, we have some freedom to let go of the outcome, because the decision that we've made is in line with values that we know matter, that we know are important. And the process of dealing with whatever that outcome is that's what human life is all about. So making decisions in line with our values doesn't mean that everything will go smoothly, but it does mean that we are willing to accept whatever comes along because we are happy with the decision that we made. And how much better that is than that icky, wishy-washy, untrusting feeling. That contrast for me is so striking. And it's one of the best changes that I've seen in myself as I've grown as a person since becoming a parent. And I would love that for everybody to have their own confidence and trust themselves and make it so that we don't need to constantly have a coach that we need to ask, to constantly need reassurance from people around us who may give us advice, and then we've got to filter through that advice and decide whether we like it or not. When we can trust ourselves, things are a lot better.
Wow, that's such an important, good point about the outcome and being okay with that. I just love what you said. Also, I want to say when it comes to parenting, why values are important is if you made a decision based on your values, then if other people judge you, you should be okay with that because it came from your values. You know strongly why you made a certain decision. And I think you are going to be more tolerant and accepting of other people's choices when it comes to parenting. Because if you made a decision, a certain thing in parenting and it's aligned with your values, the other person has their own set of values and it's okay. They don't have to share the same value. I think it invites a conversation and puts us in a more compassionate, understanding place, as opposed to more judgmental and less tolerant. For me, that makes a difference.
Yes, I agree. And I've seen that play out in my own judginess. Don't we all just tend toward judginess anyway? And I've noticed that when we say to our kids, we learn this as parents very early. It's very classic advice that in their family, they may do it this way, but in our family, we do it this way, right? And that's to answer the kid who wants to know why we don't do what so-and-so does. And I think that that is shorthand for this conversation we're having about values. In their family, they have values that prioritize X, Y, and Z, obviously, because that's the decision that they've made in their family. And in our family, we don't value those as much as we value this and this and this. And therefore, that's going to guide the way that we run that particular sphere in our family. So again, speaking back to that confidence about making these decisions from a place that we can accept the judgment that may come. Yes, of course, judgments always come, and that's okay. And the better we can get at not judging others, the happier we'll be.
Yes, true. And you're talking about kids. I think we should do another episode about teaching our children our values or how we help our children uncover their values, because there is, there's going to be a difference. I already see in my teenage daughter that there are certain things we share as a value, but there are certain things that she's different. She doesn't hold the same value, and that can create a friction in parenting. But that's for another time.
Even though that's for another time, one piece that I'd like to put a pin in and a preview, I suppose, to that future episode is that teaching our kids values is all about storytelling, the stories that we tell in our families. There's a lot of research that shows that storytelling is where the magic is at in the space of teaching values. So yes, I'm happy to set that aside for now, but I had to get that in.
Yeah, I love that. You said that in our AI episode. And if people haven't listened to that episode, I strongly encourage them to listen to that episode. You're right. I did some research in preparation for this episode. And it turns out some researchers say that by age 5 or by age 7, children already learn and internalize their values. And I was really surprised by that. From one hand, but from the other, I wasn't, because if you remember in one of our support calls, we did talk about values and our childhoods and things like that. And when you mention stories, I immediately go back to my childhood and think about how I learned, where I learned my values, right? Yes, childhood is an important place to go to. And the first exercise sort of that I want to do with you is going to our childhood. I know you already mentioned stories, books, TV, media. I think the culture that we were immersed in, the things that we consumed as children, it all shapes our worldview and our values. It's not like our parents sit down and teach us a certain value as a lesson. It's who they are. It's how they live their life. It's what you see in your neighborhood. It's not always the parents or the nuclear family itself. In fact, on reflecting on my values, I can say that the larger community, grandparents, extended family, neighbors, teachers, the shows that I watched on TV or the things I was exposed to shape my worldview more than my parents. Of course, I internalized things from my parents, but there are so many things that I learned from the larger world than my own little narrow family universe. So
religion is one thing that you didn't mention there, but I think that is
because you know why? Because I wasn't raised with religion. But you can speak to that. Yes. So please.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was raised very religious and still am, and raising my children that way. And it's some people, when they become parents, say that that's the only good that religion holds in it is the structure it gives to the teaching of values. I happen to think it's worth a lot more than that, but that's a personal opinion. And in the context of everything that you just said about the community and the friends and the neighborhood and the TV, that's religion is just another thing in that list. It is all the things that our families choose to surround us with that shape our values.
Yeah, I mean, I was raised without a religion, so there you go. Of course, I'm going to completely not even mention it, right? Again, speaks to the point of how we were raised, gives us a filter through which we see the world. Mine is without the religion. So, and of course, I have blind sides and things like that. So going back to our childhood, so I have a question then. What were some powerful experiences that you had as a child before the age of 10? So if values are formed by age 5 or 7, so let's go, around that time. You don't have to share the experiences. I can share one, but the listener can think for themselves. And if you want to share, you're welcome to, but think for yourself. When I asked that question, what came to mind? Were there powerful experiences? That could be negative or positive. I just don't want to mention only the traumatic, abuse, neglect type of experiences, right? In fact, the example I'm going to share is a positive example. Did something come to mind when I asked that question?
Yes. So I'll share the experience and I'll stop short of what I learned from it, right? Because I have a feeling that that's somewhere that you're going to take us next. So 2 things came to mind. One was a time when there was a miscommunication between me, a child, and our teenage babysitter. And I was at school and needed to take the school bus to come home, but because of this miscommunication, I thought that I was supposed to wait at school and get picked up by somebody. And consequently, I missed the school bus, and the babysitter didn't understand that that had been the exact confusion. And by the time the problem reached the ears of my parents, my poor dad thought that I had been kidnapped, I was in danger, I was being abused, he had made up this runaway story and sped home unsafely on the highway, got pulled over by the police, and then escorted by the police to arrive home, where of course he found that I was safe and he was so relieved. And that experience was, you say powerful, that was very powerful. I had never seen my dad cry like that before, but he was so panicked and then so relieved. And my mom had a very different take on the whole thing. She, of course, was scared, but she wasn't panicked. She found out earlier than he did that I was safe, and she was home with me before he arrived home. So she was nervous about how he was going to act when he got home, and I was being coached on how to behave when he got home. And goodness, it was so confusing for me. I was a little kid. I think I was 9 maybe when that happened. And my dad, when he retells that story to my kids, goodness, it's surprising to me sometimes the details that he tells a little differently than I do, because he had a different perspective and much older, of course. So that's one story. And then the second story was a little bit earlier than that. My family had gotten a computer, and computers were new in the home. Most people didn't have computers then. And I fell in love with the technology immediately. And at a very early age, I must have been about 7, I stayed up into the wee hours of the morning, which is very difficult when you're that small. And I was trying to implement something I was learning from the instruction manual of this computer, back when computers came with instruction manuals. And I wrote a simple program on the computer that could do some things, and you put inputs in and you got outputs out. And I was thrilled, and I was so excited to share this with my family. And they received me so well, and they were so supportive, and they continued to encourage and fuel this passion for technology forever, for my whole life. They still do to this day. I have this passion for technology that came across in that AI episode, I remember. So that was also another really powerful experience that felt like a turning point. It felt like it turned me in some ways into the person that I am now.
Wow. So you reflected on those experiences. Now I'm going to ask you a question. What values can you derive from those experiences that are still true for you, that they're part of your essence of who you are?
Yeah, this is the hard part, right? Values do we pull out of these powerful childhood experiences? How do we articulate this into words? Well, I think the one with my dad, I saw how crucial communication is. And a lot of people don't learn the value of communication until they're in adult relationships, having to have adult conversations about very difficult topics. Of course, as children and teenagers, we are also communicating and learning how to do it. But this experience showed me how my words and the clarity of them can truly hurt a person, can truly hurt. And I'm grateful that it wasn't my words that hurt my dad directly. And I was able to learn this by seeing the impact of a miscommunication. It was just a miscommunication. So if I had explained more clearly, or if the babysitter had asked more questions, or if she had explained more clearly, I don't know where the breakdown was exactly, but it was clearly a problem of communication and nothing else. So seeing that a communication problem can have such huge consequences. What if my dad had crashed and I didn't have my dad anymore? And that all came from a miscommunication. What if, right? So I think that clear communication was taught to me as a value really early from that experience, earlier than most. From the computer one, maybe it was about indulging my passions, recognizing what my passions are. I have struggled to articulate this in a word. This isn't like I value passion specifically. That doesn't even feel like the right word. But seeing that even little people can have a real good handle on their 46-year-old selves long before they hit that age. I knew from early on that this is a part of the world that was going to fascinate me. It did then, it still does. It is intriguing and I love it. So maybe it has to do with trust, right? Trusting that I know what I love and I like. My kids know what they love and what they like, and listening and taking seriously even the things that our little people say to us.
Wow, I'm going to dovetail. My story goes so well with yours. So when I was 6 years old, before that, I had short hair, and my uncle or my dad would always cut my hair. They never had taken me to a hair salon or anything like that. So I remember there was this hair salon in our neighborhood, and my parents one day decided to take me there to get a haircut. Pretty simple thing, right? But that changed so much for me. So I went in there, and this woman, her name was Fartush, and unfortunately I heard later that she was killed in the earthquake. I don't know how old she was, maybe in her 20s, 30s. At the time when I was 6, this woman, she asked my parents to, just sit there, and took me in as a grown-up and said, "How do you want me to cut your hair?" And just the fact that she opened the door to choicefulness, and I can choose, it's up to me, that feeling. And obviously I was taken aback, and I didn't know as a 6-year-old. Then she showed me pictures. She said, "Look at the pictures. Which style would you like me to, cut your hair?" And I looked, and I chose a bob hairstyle. And to this day, as you can see, I still have a bob haircut. It's been my signature haircut throughout my entire life. But that experience gave me this sense of I have a choice, that freedom, that autonomy, that taste. I can still taste that feeling of no one is controlling me. And I have this, I'm so grateful to that woman who opened the door. And so my value based on that experience is freedom, autonomy.
Love it.
I think I like the word freedom more than autonomy. And I want to say that certain words, certain values, you may also appreciate or have the freedom as your value, but the way I define may be completely different. So for me, freedom means you can't tell me what to do. I have a sense of agency, choice, control over the matter. It's my biggest core value to this day. I use it every day in my life to guide me in parenting and otherwise. And we have spoken about this, but that's what I learned from that. Second story is, I think when I was 5 years old, I think I shared on the support call about this, that I was, we didn't have a lot of toys and all that in the Soviet Union. We were kind of deprived, but we had our imagination. So I was at my grandparents' house frequently because my parents worked. And so I used to cut out of a big box. I made a TV and I would just sit in there as I am a news anchor or a TV person. I would take my grandmother's shawl or a big blanket, wrap around me to pretend I am a grown-up. And I knew how to read when I was 5. So I would take the TV guide, right? Remember, they used to be printed like what show comes after what. So I would sit down and say, welcome everyone to the evening news or whatever. I don't remember what show it was. And I would read and my grandparents would clap and I would just ask me questions. I was in my element. So fast forward 42 years, 43, I am a podcast host, right? I do the same thing. So my value from that, again, that freedom of expression, originality, creativity. I think originality and creativity, being who you are and doing things the way you want to do, how you want to do, is huge for me. This creativity part and the freedom together is who defines Hannah Seawold, basically. So those are 2 stories from my childhood. Did you have a favorite toy? I know we talked about this before, and you said yours was the computer. Were there games that you played outside with kids, or do you remember you had a toy?
My computer was my favorite toy, that's for sure. And I did a lot of things on that computer. I did play some prepackaged games, usually things like sports games. I remember the Winter Olympics game that we had where it was a whole collection of different skiing type games. It was a ski jump where you had to time things just right. And there was a cross country where you had to get the rhythm just right. And there were a few things like that. There was also a game where you had to deliver newspapers to the neighborhood and not misdeliver to doors that didn't subscribe. And then you had to go collect the money from the subscriptions. That was a fun game. And there was another game that stands out where it was writing a story and then illustrating the story. And I can picture the screen in my mind right now with the picture space up top, and they gave you different shape tools that you could use to assemble shapes and make the illustration that you wanted. And then the story down below could be as long or as short as you wanted. And I was taking some photos of my kids' schoolwork recently, and they had similar paper layouts of the same setup where it's a big blank space at the top and then a few lines at the bottom for a beginning writer to practice their writing and put some sentences down that describe the picture up above. That's what my computer screen looked like. And when I was taking pictures of their old schoolwork, I imagined that computer game. When it came to outside, it was a lot of unstructured play, and I don't really remember what we did, but I do remember wheels were almost always a part of being outside. We had skateboards and bicycles and pogo sticks, which is wheelless, but it's the same idea. Getting on something to play with. We did a lot of that sort of thing. More quietly, I did a lot of reading. I read quietly in my room. I brought books everywhere, and I would climb trees and go read in the trees. So I guess those are the things that really made up my childhood, was a lot of wheels, a lot of reading, and a lot of computers.
So how do they translate into your values?
Again, that's work. That's hard to do. Let's see. The reading turned me into a lifelong learner. I'm confident of that because I love learning for the sake of learning. I just discovered about myself the other day, listening to someone else's podcast about gifted kids. That's really what I was a gifted kid that loved learning. And I'm still a gifted adult who loves learning. Learning is a need for me. If I'm in a role at work where I'm not learning something new, I'm going to go sacrifice work time, productive time to go learn something. It's probably going to be work related because I have this loyalty to my employer. They're paying me to do work, but I will go learn something. And it might mean that I don't get done the task that you, boss lady, wanted me to do. So be careful to make sure that I'm always learning. Otherwise, I will go get it myself. So that's where the reading definitely steered me into learning. And then maybe the moving around, the bicycles, that feels a lot like the freedom that you were talking about, that I always enjoyed being able to move around. But my parents had pretty clear limits around what spaces we were allowed to ride our bicycles in, and we knew when we were going too far. And so that doesn't exactly feel like freedom. It felt like freedom within the constraints of safety, which is supposed, that's what we want to supply our kids. But that's not a driving value. That's simply an element of what that experience was. So maybe it's not so much freedom as speed, the wind in my hair, the exhilaration. Exhilaration is a word I learned from Karen Lott Culp, a podcaster I also enjoy a lot. And I enjoy doing things like skiing and hiking. And if I'm just walking on the sidewalk, it feels like a chore. Walking on a treadmill is a chore, but walking the same walk through the woods or down a mountainside or something a bit more exciting. So I don't know if that is a value that rises to one of my topmost ones, but it's certainly something I notice about myself, that I do like that wind in my hair type feeling.
Well, like a carefree adventure. I'm hearing words like that: adventure, free exploration, excitement. Like I'm hearing echoes of those kinds of words. And yes.
And I love that exploration word, that even overlaps with the learning part, right? Because it's learning and exploring are very similar.
And we don't have to really have the exact word. I mean, of course, it helps if, like, I have thought about this freedom so much that if you ask me what are your top 3 values, freedom is number 1. But for someone who hasn't thought about their values, it's okay if in the beginning you don't know the word, but you can summarize an experience. That's why I'm walking you and I through through the exercises, so that the listener can do the same thing, and you can come up with the theme, and then you can think about more and eventually come up with the word from the 200 list of values that signifies, your experience. So it's okay if you don't have the right word, and if you are in the ballpark, as long as you know what it is, right? I think that's important.
And it's so helpful to have you echo back to me what you heard from my experience. I wish everybody could have you like this. And it makes me wonder if AI could help. I instantly want to go put this story into ChatGPT and say, what values do you want to reflect back that show up as threads in here? That could be an interesting experiment.
Yeah, that could be. Yeah. I mean, this is part of like therapy or having a coach or someone, right? When you share your experience, we see patterns, we hear the words, because we're not attached to your experience. And of course, I can throw some words out there, and whatever resonates with you the most, that's the one that you can grab and go. For me, I was an outdoorsy kid. I played outside a lot with you had wheels. I never learned how to ride a bicycle. To this day, I don't know how to ride a bicycle.
Wow.
Yes. Can you believe that? But for me, it was the ball, the jump rope and the ball and the Chinese rope. It's called the Chinese rope. So I played a lot. I organized games. I was also artsy, creative, artistic. I could sing and dance and do plays. So in my neighborhood, I had leadership skills, I guess. I would organize the kids to do a play, to put the ballet, to put a show out, to recite poems and do these kinds of things. So obviously, I mean, I can speak so much about my childhood games that we played and the activities. I wrote down some of them, and they all include the element of freedom. I mentioned this last time. I don't want to take up so much time today. Maybe one day I'll do a childhood episode, but most of this include that freedom, that no adult is there and I can do whatever I want, create the game and have control over it, organize people, community. So when I'm reflecting back, these are the values that are still true to me: community, relationships, organizing communities. Like I organized a book club in my where I live. I naturally have that knack or the desire to organize something around something. Again, creativity and freedom. But one of my favorite toys upon reflection was the kaleidoscope, and I mentioned it last time. It was this fascinating thing, visual, creative, pattern making toy, not the American version, which is like a very childlike, but the one that the Soviet Union had. It was like a real mirror, real stuff. And I could spend hours just looking through that kaleidoscope and seeing the light and the patterns and the color. This is who I am. I love light, color, pattern, creativity. That's part of it. And speaking of books, that ties in with the autonomy or freedom. I remember I was in third grade with my brother. We had the freedom to walk in town. We went to the library, and for the first time, I was without an adult, and I chose a book. It was a yellow book in Russian. It said Сказки, fairy tales. And to this day, I remember I checked out the book by myself and I carried proudly, walked like I had this. I always loved that sense of freedom. My mom would give me money to go buy food and things. I was 6 years old. I was shopping in town, walking, getting milk from this woman who sold milk. I would just go every evening, cross streets and buy the milk and come home, talk to adults, talk to people. That's who I am to this day. So that freedom, you can't tell me what to do. I'm doing it my way. It's such a big part of me.
I'm hearing that freedom, and I'm also hearing some undercurrents of mastery and competence. And
yes,
because the freedom to, I don't know, ride a bicycle doesn't mean much to you because you don't have the competence to go along with it. You aren't practiced at it, and you don't feel self-efficacious, is a word the schools really love to use about self-efficacy. And it's no wonder that you enjoy this confident feeling. I think every human enjoys feeling confident about what they're doing. But anytime that we can indulge the things that we're confident in and show our abilities, going to be more comfortable in that space. And when you have the freedom to show what you want to show, that gives you specifically the fulfillment that you're looking for. It's why you do what you think.
Yeah. And in the podcasting sphere, I can bring it to current, time. How does it affect? Well, I maintain creative freedom. So many times people have reached out. There are networks, right? Podcasting networks. They reached out to me. We want you to be part of our network. No, I can never be part of anything. Like, I am my own thing. Advertisers, I cannot work with advertisers. I can't sell my soul and abide by your laws and by your rules. No, this is my free space, this creative freedom. So in my podcast, I choose my own guests. Don't pitch me guests. It shows up in so many ways, right? How I do it, who I am. In parenting, it shows up the same way. So, and it was not squashed in me. I have to say that I am one of the very lucky children whose parents didn't kill that. They always honored that creativity, that, this freedom to be you. And I value that so much. And I hope I raised my daughter that way. I hope I didn't kill that. So wrapping up the childhood portion of our conversation, I want to say that there is a difference between values and needs. You mentioned that learning is a need for you, right? So needs are universal. We all have universal needs to be seen, to be heard, to feel significant, to have a need for autonomy, and on and on. But I think values are very personal. So I think that's the main distinction. And so when it comes to values, for me, the conversation is more about uncovering our values because we already possess them rather than identifying, or, it's about the discovery process. So I want every person to know that they do have values. It's all about uncovering them. How are you doing time-wise?
I have abundant time.
Now I'm sharing my screen with you, and there are over 200 values, and I will have this list available for the listener. Why don't we take a look at the list? And this is what I use in my work. I ask people to take a look and write down what resonates with them, what words they like, and it could be like up to 20 words, right? And then we narrow it down. Then we narrow it down to 5 to 3. So go wild in the beginning. This goes in in alphabetical order. So what resonates with you, for example, from this first page, Jen?
Let's see. Curiosity, peace, and calm is very similar to peace. I'll kind of list them together. They're all positive things. It's so hard to say not any of these. There's dedication and dependability and respect, reverence. Goodness, there's so many that are all positive that it's hard to say what we don't value. And that was a point that I wanted to make, actually. I'll come back to your question about what else jumps out. So far, I've got a couple about when we're considering what values from this list we want to pick. It's not like we're saying, for example, there's empathy on this list. I'm not saying I don't value empathy. Of course I do. It's a positive thing, and I think there should be more of it in the world. But what I'm saying is that there's very few decisions that I face in the day where empathy or not showing empathy is the choice in front of me. Because when I can, I will always be empathetic. When I can't, and that's it. It's not that I am sacrificing anything to make sure that this value is being shown, being clever or clear. Goodness, again, other things from the list, it's not that I don't value those things. It's that those values, those positive elements in my world don't usually conflict with anything else that I'm trying to get done. Self-reliance is on this list. I either can or I can't be self-reliant, but it's not like I am going out to develop my self-reliance, my skills, because I value it so much. It just is. And it's good when I can be, and when I can't, okay. However, the ones that jumped out at me, curiosity, for example, there are plenty of times where I have to either push myself to be curious because I know this about myself. I know that being curious will be good for me if I can stop and be curious instead of judgy, for example. Or the other way around. Sometimes I'm being overly curious about things and I have to restrain myself. And not everyone wants to talk about all their medical details. And I always want to know the medical details of my friends. If you're willing to tell me, I want to hear the story because I'm curious. That's one of the areas where I'm very, very curious. And that's why that one jumps out at me, because I find myself having to be conscious about it more often. My empathy, again, I don't really have to be conscious about that. I'm either being empathetic because it's what I have capacity for in the moment, or I'm not. And I always work to improve that. Fantastic. But very rarely does it hit me the same way as my curiosity does. I don't know if that's as clear to you as it is to me in my mind about the things I'm not choosing from this list. Because you asked what jumps out at you, and my brain instantly went to, I can pick a few that jump out at me, but then I feel bad for all the ones I'm leaving behind. What does that say about me?
No, that's very natural. And that's part of it. Of course, these are really good values, that they're positive words. Obviously, we can resonate with all of them. But I think when it comes to values, I would say make a list from this list of 20 to 25 that are resonant for you, that are important to you. I think then distill it into like 15, then distill that list into top 3 to 5. So when it comes to values, this is how I think about it. We have our core values, top 3 to 5 that guide us, and we make decisions almost every day. They're based in our core values, like freedom, autonomy. For me, originality, creativity is like I use it every day. Or another one of mine is kindness, compassion. I use it every day. I can 100% say that things I do in my day-to-day life, there are certain values, because I have done a lot of work in terms of values. I know they are present in my day-to-day life. These are my core values. Of course, empathy is important. Of course, no, responsibility is not as important for me. Let's choose a different word. Clarity, comfort, a lot of things are important, but I think of it this way. Imagine a peach, right? The pit of the peach is your core values. The outside, the meat of the peach are also important values, but you're not using them maybe on a day-to-day basis, but they are values, definitely are strongly resonant for you. They're part of who you are. And there is the outer part, maybe the skin of the peach, other set of values. So there's 3 tiers, right? You can think of important, more important, most important, or core values, however you want to identify. That's how I think of values. And when I'm guiding someone through this list, that's what I want you to do. Make that, like a 3 circles, the core, the outer, and the larger circle around that. What jumps at you, and then you can distill it into your core values.
Move to the second page now, and it's exciting to see a fresh list of words because I picked, I think, 4 from that first page. And now as we're looking on the second page, I'm seeing different parts of the alphabet. So there's love and humility. Those are jumping out at me on this page. Let's see, I see your freedom one. And it's beautiful to hear your stories behind that freedom, because you're exactly right that when I see freedom, or when a patriotic person sees freedom, they're probably not going to look at it the same way that you look at freedom. The same way with me when I was talking about clear communication. That is not something that from the outside, without knowing that story about my dad, it wouldn't hit someone the same way. So I kind of see why you're giving these loose instructions to just see what jumps out at you, because that's exactly what's going on, is that as I look at these words, there's glimpses of stories that are going through my mind of when I've shown that or seen that, or other people I admire who have demonstrated that. Those are the things that are jumping out. I still feel bad for the ones that I'm leaving behind, though, because again, what does that say about me that I don't value thankfulness? Again, it's just the thing. It doesn't rise to the top as a decision-making driver. And we talked about this at the earlier conversation about values too, that led to this episode, when our values come into conflict. Did you want to touch on that now? Because that's part of how I'm choosing. Okay.
Yes, please. Yeah. I have the freedom to explore.
So I'm borrowing this idea from Rachel Nielsen, who hosts the 3 in 30 podcast. So I want to make sure to give clear credit to where I learned this concept, because it was really powerful for me, where she explains in her efforts to help parents identify their values. She does talk about values conflicting as an important signal for us to first identify where are these values coming into conflict, and that it comes down to, it helps us to choose these values that we're choosing from the list and to leave behind the ones that we're leaving behind. Because when I talk about peace being one of my values, for example, that is a value that comes into conflict with my daily life all the time. There are plenty of places in my life where others are disrupting my peace, or I have the choice to confront someone or some relationship, knowing that that will disturb the peace. And sometimes it's worth it, and sometimes it's not, to me, because I value peace. And that means I overlook more than most people because I value peace. I don't confront, not because I'm afraid of confrontation, but because I value peace. And obviously that does mean that values come into conflict. We talked about clear communication, and overlooking somebody's hurtful behavior would not be clear and kind communication, but it does hold peace as a priority. So when I'm facing a decision like that, what will I decide? Well, that's a very helpful challenge to examine. Why is this difficult for me? Well, it's because these 2 good choices are in conflict with each other. Do I confront the person or do I not? Do I give them clear communication or do I preserve peace? Will it preserve peace if I say nothing? In the long run, hurt the peace. Either one could be true, and I really need to think through that carefully.
And to add to that, I interjected, you're right. And yes, we may have 10 to 15 values, but prioritizing them in this stage of your life, in this moment, this is very applicable for parents, right? While freedom was my value, top value, when I was a new mom, obviously it wasn't a guiding, I couldn't choose freedom as much. I had to prioritize, shuffle my values. So I think, again, know yourself. And why are you prioritizing certain values now? I think it's, again, I'm hearing that in your explanation.
Yes. And when our values come into conflict with other values, that's when it's important to know what our values are. That's when it's important to understand that I'm making this choice out of my value for peace, or I'm making this decision because I love you. And even though there are other good things that I could do in this situation, I'm choosing this path because of this value And it's that line of thinking that gives us the confidence that we talked about at the top of the discussion. And when I look at this list and I see things on it like sharing as a value, it's true that that's a good thing. But how often am I facing a situation where sharing is the deciding factor for me between two good choices or more, two or more good choices? In my life, not very often. In other people's lives who have different backgrounds and different values, that may be a bigger deal. And sharing is something that they want to elevate to this core value status that you talked about, the pit of the peach. And that's where it's not that any of these ones that we choose to leave behind are in any way devalued for us. That's not what we're saying when we say we don't value sharing. What we're saying is that the value of sharing is one that I will always choose whenever it comes into conflict with other values. I will always choose peace in my case.
Yeah. So this brings me to a question. A lot of people struggle with a question: should I stay or should I go in my marriage? Right? Or shall I have another kid? Second, third, fourth kid. That's also another decision people contemplate about, or a job related questions people have frequently. I feel like marriage, kids, and job. Shall I change my job? Shall I get out of this career? Shall I pursue such and such dream that I had? And so when it comes to big decisions like that, it is absolutely crucial to know our values and to be guided by our values, because then we're going to make a certain decision and not be happy by it. But if we made a decision to stay in this marriage because it is aligned with whatever value that we have in this moment, it gives us more. We feel okay with our choice, as opposed to we don't know, wishy-washy. We're choosing to stay because we're afraid, because we haven't thought about it, for whatever reason, right? If we don't know the real value, then we're more conflicted and we feel unease. Also, when it comes to jobs or kids, I think it's so important to know our values. For me, for example, I don't want to buy a big house. I am renting and I'm okay with that. And it is grounded in so many values for reasons that I won't go into right now because for the sake of time, but other people judge my choice, right? But freedom plays part of it. So let's go through the list and finalize your list, because I already wrote down my top 15 from this list.
I got to 8 so far. So yes, that's good.
Okay, you're doing good. So for me, I already looked at the list and wrote down the ones that are my values. Well, as I said, freedom is number one. Second is authenticity. By authenticity, I also mean originality, being who you are, doing it your own way. And it sort of ties in with freedom for me. And I want to say that sometimes when you're choosing your values, for example, the one I'm going to mention now, kindness, altruism, compassion, they sort of fall under the same broad category. So if you have on your list words in the same family, maybe choose the one that best characterizes all. So for example, giving, generosity, altruism are big values for me. But if I think about it, instead of making them single items, I can group them together. So kindness is a big value for me, and I exercise kindness on a daily basis. Compassion is a big value for me. Creativity, I mentioned already. Relationships, community, it's under one umbrella. Peace is significant for me. It's in my top 5. Integrity, giving, generosity, spirituality is a value for me. Simplicity is important for me. Simplifying things, life matters, simplifying home, simplicity in everything. I love making complex things simple, digestible. I can apply simplicity in many, many areas of my life. This is a big value I hold. Order is a big one, but it sort of ties with simplicity for me. Curiosity is a big one. I think that's my list so far.
Good.
As you can see, I'm very passionate about a lot of these values.
And we've already been talking for so long, and we could talk about each of those for the same amount of time all over again.
Yes. So you have your list. You do.
And I have the same dynamic that you have, where there are a few places where there's some word families that have grouped together. And I'm not being too picky about which word I choose, because the reality is that all languages imperfectly represent our ideas and our thinking. And these words each capture an aspect of what I'm trying to get at, but there is no one word for the thing, and that's okay. And that's why I kind of look at some of these in pairs or triplets. Like there's one on my list about temperance or moderation or modesty. Putting these kind of together says something different than any one of them would say alone.
Yeah. So identifying them is number one step. Ranking them is another way of thinking about your values. Do you know what I mean? So you don't have to feel guilty for not valuing empathy or thoughtfulness, but you can rank them and at least have some comfort that they are still there. You hold them as values, but on day-to-day basis, they're not your core values. They're on your list.
And for me, it's really easy to pinpoint my number one value. Maybe the 2 and 3 are a little harder, but the number one value for me is love. And inside of love, there's a lot of things. I think the loving thing to do is to be empathetic and compassionate and kind. So that's also another thing that makes it a little easier to leave behind some of those other positive things, because love, my top value, captures so much of what I might want to say.
That's exactly right. Yes, I think knowing what a certain word represents for you is key. So when it comes to values, I help my clients do one exercise, and I'm going to ask you because it ties in with this list. So think about some decisions that you made in the past 6 months or within a year. Like take a moment to reflect. I did this morning in preparation for this episode, and I'm like, I don't think I have made any decisions this year. But upon reflecting, it turned out I did make some big decisions. If you want, I can go first. And why is this related to our values? Because oftentimes when you ask someone, what are your values? What's important to you? People may not feel, they may not have a good answer. This is important to me. This is important to me. It's hard to say, pinpoint what our values are. But if you ask someone, what decisions have you made in the past year or within 6 months? Write down those decisions. Big decisions. Did you move? Did you decide to change your job? Did you decide to get married or get a divorce? Did you decide to get a diagnosis? Did you decide to make an investment? Whatever that choice is, write them down. And after, I'm hoping you already took a look at this big list of 200 values and made a small list for yourself. Now, look at your decisions. What do they reflect? Do they reflect the values that are in your list of top 15 values? Can you match them? Because that's where the crux of things is, right? You may say, such and such is a value for me, but in the past year, you made decisions and it's not reflected in your decisions. Maybe it's time to reevaluate that value. So I'm asking you, Jen, did you make any decisions in the past 6 months or a year? And if yes, are your values reflected in those decisions?
Yes. And I'll get to that decision in just a second. I wanted to comment on the point you just made about decisions, because not every value that we hold is going to factor into every decision that we make. So I have a value listed here around curiosity, discovery, exploration, and learning that we talked about earlier, but that didn't play into my decisions in the example. Maybe it did. I don't know. Let's talk through it. So about last spring. So we're talking in the fall of 23. And so last spring, my kiddos were struggling in school, just the way kids struggle in school. It was nothing extraordinary, but my older one was asking if she could be homeschooled, which unfortunately for us is not something that I can accommodate. But I was now interested in what kinds of alternative schooling options might be out there. So as I did some reading about the possibilities, I discovered a self-directed learning option at a democratic school near us that has proven to be pretty interesting for us. And it's extremely inconvenient to bring my kids to this school. It's an hour commute to get them there in the mornings. And then I have to drive home and finish my workday. And then someone has to drive an hour back and pick them up at the end of the day and then bring them home another hour. So it's a lot of driving, very inconvenient, and something I thought about long and hard before making the decision to put them in this school. And as I think about what values were playing into that decision, it was certainly a trust in them. Truth and honesty is one of the things that I have on my short list here. And going back to my parents indulging my love for computers, right? And listening to our young people about what they're asking for and trying to find a way to give them the things that are good for them that we also value. Let's see if there's a way to say, yes, I try to trust what they are asking for. And this was something I saw a way that I could do. It would be difficult, but I could do it. And love for them, of course, and the sacrifice that comes from what we do for the people that we love. But another value that really played into this is also on my list, which is collaboration. When my kids are struggling with anything, one of the things I always try and do with them is to collaborate about what the solution might be, or even further back, what the problem exactly is. I don't assume that I know what the problem is, and I certainly try not to assume that I know what the solution is. And it means that all of our family life takes a longer to solve problems. It would be so much faster if I just did the controlling thing and said, your shoes are in the car, let's go. And I commanded and directed and insisted. But I don't do that because I don't value efficiency and speed. I value collaboration. And so I work with them to figure out what's the best way to manage our shoes in the morning, right?
But I'm hearing two other values in that story. Your love of learning, being open-minded and learning, because when you said, I don't know what the problem is, what the solution is, that tells me that you have a curious mind and you're coming from this openness for learning and exploring. I'm hearing your other values that you talked about, in the beginning of the episode reflected, even though you're not highlighting them per se.
Yeah, I think you're right. And that speaks to the conversation we had earlier about being mindful of our values and sometimes making decisions that reflect our values in a mindless way. And when we move through the world mindlessly, doing things automatically, it sometimes works out okay and sometimes doesn't. And whenever things don't work out, it's helpful to know what went wrong. And if only I had paid more attention to this value or that value in that decision-making process, perhaps this wouldn't have worked out the way that it did. So mindfulness is always helpful. And this exercise with values gives us one more thing to be mindful about, but I don't consider it to be a complexity that is unnecessary. I think this is one of the necessary things that will only make things better for us.
Yeah, another way of trying to uncover your values would be, what do you feel strongly about? Are they causes or charities per se that you feel strongly about? I reflected upon this myself this morning. Or what are your pet peeves? What bugs you about people? What annoys you? So if you talk about it and share, you may hear the theme, the reason why a certain thing matters to you. And then you can say, that's why, because this is a value for me. That's why I am annoyed by such and such behavior or by such and such.
So what about you? What was your decision?
Oh, my decisions. I'm going to go with podcasting related decisions because I haven't made any other major decisions in terms of parenting or life or anything like that. Well, I hired a new podcast editor, as you very well know, and it was not an easy process, but I did use freedom, creativity, curiosity, all the community relationships, right? I wanted to make sure that I utilized my values to make a decision. Also, I, decided not to be part of networks in terms of podcasting networks, or I made a decision for the reasons mentioned above, not to work with sponsors or advertisers and to have a show that is listener supported, because it's a strong value for me to maintain that creative freedom, autonomy, and not be told what to do, what numbers. I don't want to be dependent on them, but I also hold a strong value of generosity, giving, integrity. If I'm giving something of value to my community, which is one of my values. There is a community around the podcast. I want my listener to give it back by saying thank you. I don't want to sell you a mattress or a food product or anything. It's icky. It's not aligned with me. So if you feel compelled, you can give money to support the show, to support this endeavor. So it makes it more aligned that we are in this giving space. You know what I mean? Service, generosity, that's part of my thing. And I continued the support calls twice a month. They are free. I hold space for people, as you know, because I value, again, community, relationships, service, giving. It's important for me. I fired a podcast guest, which was, again, it was aligned with my values. You know, this is my show. I stand for certain values and principles. I don't care if you have a big name or you are some big shot. This is my show and I'm running it a certain way. And if you do not, I don't want to say comply, but I said this conversation is over after 11 minutes. I let the podcast guest go because I cannot promote what the person was saying. This is not who I am, what the show stands for. So those are some decisions that I made, you know, that my values are reflected in them.
I'm curious about that last point you made, that I hear a couple of values in conflict there when you made the decision to end that conversation. Because what I know about you is I see a person who loves to learn and is open-minded and understands the different perspectives that are out there in the world. And you're very compassionate to the fact that people come from different places, right? So how does that harmonize with this person who said, you don't belong in my space?
Oh, very good point. You know what? Unfortunately, I can't say much. So, because this person was so inauthentic, so not salesy even, so inauthentic is the word. And she had this attitude of arrogance. She didn't even know my name. She had not listened to the show. She didn't know my name. She came to, I don't know why she came. And it was a pitch and I regret not listening to myself. Of course, I knew this person existed for the longest time and I never invited her to my podcast, but their publisher reached out to me. I made a wrong decision, right? But I corrected it. I didn't release that episode. After 11 minutes, I said, oh my gosh, this is not in congruence with who I am, with what I feel, what she's saying. This is so inauthentic. Even the interaction between me and her, fake, it just didn't land.
It was that icky feeling.
It was that icky feeling. And, you know, she was not answering the questions. Like I had, you know, this is a podcast. We converse, we talk, we go deep, we take detours. It's a podcast. This is not a radio interview. I asked her a question and she was like, well, she gave me one word as an answer, one word. I said, like, where do we go from here? Like, there's no place for exploration. So that was one example. Another example was she was late. Like, there were so many things and I just couldn't take it anymore. I said, no, I don't care who she is. Even this is like Oprah Winfrey. This is my show. This is my gig. I have a loyalty to my listeners for what I want to bring to the show. And this conversation does not match that standard that I created and my listeners expect things from me. So I had to let that person go. Integrity played a role. Authenticity played a role. Freedom played a role. My devotion to my community and service guided my decision. And I didn't want to succumb to like societal things just because she's a big name. I don't care. This is my show and you cannot come and, you know, I asked a question. For example, one of the things was she came to speak about certain points and I asked a very open-ended question. It was not about her book or about her agenda. She was flustered and she made a comment about it, you know, criticized, why am I asking that question? I'm like, you know what? Then we're done here.
Yeah, I see that. And I'm glad that you recapped it in terms of the values, because that's the helpful thing, to see how the decisions that we make are driven by our values. And I'm hearing your tone of voice and seeing your confidence as you're telling this story. Again, you can stand in this decision and not feel continually disturbed by how it went. You're not still angry. You're not hurt. You're not worried about how you might be perceived. None of that is true. You can confidently stand there and say, I made this decision, it was in line with my values, and we're moving on. And that's what all of us want, is the clarity to be able to say something similar about the decisions that we make.
It was hard. It was unpleasant. And you can hear in my voice, it's pretty emotional because she's a big shot, really big shot. And since the publisher had reached out to me, I had to sort of report back. But honestly, they didn't even follow through. They didn't even ask, how did the interview go? This is how much they valued my podcast. And this is why she won't be on my podcast, because they didn't give a damn about following up. How did it go? You know what I mean? For them, it was just another promotional avenue. Well, for me, it's my show that I've created and dedicated, poured my heart and soul for 8 years. You can't come and do that in my own home. That's how protective I am of my community.
And it's those values coming into conflict again, because I mentioned at the start of my question that I know you to be this kind of person, and that decision does not seem to line up at all. But what you're saying is, it's true that I am that kind of person, and I also value these other things, and my gesture just moved higher because I value these other things so much more than also these other good things that are also true about me. And that's where our ranking comes into play.
Yes, good point.
These are the values that characterize the decisions that I make when they come into conflict with other good things that I might decide.
I agree. So I came up with a few questions that can help us uncover our values again, because it's not always straightforward. If someone is having a hard time answering the question, what decisions you've made, or if you're having a hard time choosing from the 200-word list, here are some additional ways of thinking about your values. What makes you happy? Simple question. What makes you happy? Okay, that's great. For me, it's people, it's community, it's doing something creative with people. This is what makes me happy. Another one, what are you resentful? Are there places that you feel resentful, angry, and frustrated? Because there must be some injustice that you're seeing. That's something, that you feel angry about, or you're resentful. If you uncover, there is a value underneath that.
I love this question. I hadn't ever thought about, of course, I struggle, as we all do, with resentments and frustrations. I have one that comes to mind immediately that I won't open up too much about publicly, but the resentment rests in that top value of love. It's in this space, the reason that I am so resentful and so hurt and so frustrated by the situation is because I am not feeling loved there. And I feel like my love is not welcome there. And in both of those cases, it should be. It should not be this way, but it is. And that gap between what I expect it to be, what it should be, and what it actually is, that gap explains my resentment. And it comes down to that primary value of love.
Wow, here's a question. Would you sacrifice your core value for money?
Never. No.
Then that's a real value. If you know that you can't sacrifice that, then that's a strong value for you. Do you envision in the long run, like 10 years, 20 years from now, that a certain value will still hold true to you? It will still be your value when you look at that list. See how freedom has played a big role in my life, right? Or authenticity since I was a kid. It hasn't changed. So it's part of me.
Yes, I think my top two values, that's true. Love and that peace/calm. Absolutely. I see them and their firmness. And I see the flexibility in that I have come to value collaboration more in my parenting years than I did before. Of course, I enjoyed being collaborated with, and I liked being listened to when people would collaborate with me. But it wasn't until I was a parent and in the position to decide whether or not we would collaborate. That's when that value became even more crystallized. It's the word you used before. I really like that. So it's collaboration has been there, but it has grown in its importance during this season. But my top values are pretty firm. I don't see them going anywhere.
How about this one? During which activities do you feel most alive? Not so much like the happiness question, but in what activities like you feel alive in your life?
I had a great conversation just this morning with my 11-year-old on our long drive on the way to school, where we were learning from each other. We were talking about school subjects, really. She wanted to know what capitalism was and what communism was and what socialism was and what the difference was and why certain regimes have fallen and grown the way they have in world history. And I was learning her viewpoints and she was learning the academic portion from me. We were learning from each other. And that has carried me through my whole day so far. Talk about making me feel alive is when I'm learning with somebody else, learning with people. Learning is much more important to me than I realized before this conversation.
It's probably your dopaminergic, circuits in your brain. It gives you dopamine. It's like it's what also mastery, competence. You're learning. You're in charge. I can see that. Yeah, it's so interesting. You're making discoveries as we speak. How about this? During stressful moments, do you still have your values? Do they still show up?
They steer what I do in those stressful moments because it is hard to stay calm and be peaceful. But that is one of my primary values, I've said. And I have a phrase that I say to myself about what is the peaceful thing to do? What will restore peace here? Because when I'm stressed, sometimes it's stressed in relationship with other people, and sometimes it's stressed just in my own expectations of myself. But I come back to what will bring me peace because that's my value. That's the thing that I'm looking for. And so I think that very resolutely answers that, yes, I definitely show that value even when I'm stressed.
How about this one? In the times of stress, have you lost any of your values? See, this goes back to the question that you asked about me firing the podcast guest, in which I chose different values. I didn't lose necessarily, right? My value of compassion and all of that. But I think those other values became more top surface, more important in the time of stress. I think it's also important to recognize that I didn't neglect those values, but I chose to exercise those other ones. This is a good one. It helped me understand your question.
Yeah, I like that question. So, with love as my top value, of course, I've done things that are not loving in moments of stress. But I think the fact that I don't feel right with that, that is the thing that bothers me about the way I behaved when I reflect on my slip ups. It's not that when I'm stressed and when I have to reflect on a choice that I regret, it's not that I'm regretting that I didn't make an improvement. I'm not regretting that I didn't show enough respect. I'm not regretting any of those things. What I'm regretting is that what I did was unloving. And that's when I can settle on that's the value I just violated. That's when I'm at peace and I can say, that was the problem. Yes, if I had been true to my values, this unfortunate incident wouldn't have happened.
How about this question? I'm not expecting you to answer. I mean, I'm having a hard time answering it. What would you die for? Let's think about that, and the listener can think too. But, are there any values that you hold that you would make sacrifices for, that you would even sacrifice your life?
Mm-hmm. Well, from my religious framework, I think my love for God is the thing that I would die for. And that shows up in different people's lives in very different ways, depending on their backgrounds. Even if they're religious people, their love for God means something different to them. But I know what it means to me, and that's what matters, even if I can't articulate it to others. So to me, that's an easy one to answer, actually. But I can see how someone with less spiritual conviction might struggle where I don't.
Earlier, I mentioned that another place would be to look at the causes that you believe or the charities, what's important to you, basically, right? What do you care about? What matters to you? So I'm asking you, are there places that are important, charities, causes? I can mention mine. I do deeply care about children. Violence against children is something I have zero tolerance, and I will fight for. Homelessness and hunger, is two big causes for me too. Not that other causes are not important, but these are I would just fight and drive passionately for those things. How about you?
Mine comes down to teaching. So no wonder it's the other side of the learning coin. That I spend a lot of my time teaching my children and other people who are willing to learn what it is that I have to teach. If you don't want what I have to teach, that's also fine with me, but I'm looking for learners all the time. And I do sacrifice a lot of my time and money and energy to do teaching work. So yeah, I think that feels good to have it line up that way with my learning value.
Yeah, interesting. And the last question. I know we've been going for a long time, and this is a juicy topic, it turns out. Think about 5 people, let's say. Why do you admire them? What do you admire them for? Because your values are hidden in there.
Oh, wow. Yes. My mom comes to mind as my first person that I admire so much. I wonder if she'll listen to this and hear me tell the world how much I admire her. But yeah, she's integrity is a word that you said that I borrowed from my list too, because that's something that my mom definitely illustrates, is her integrity and honesty and her love for us, for her family, for so many people. Oh, goodness. Yeah. Other people that I admire, maybe in the larger world, people who don't know my mom. Let me think. Let me think on that for a second while you talk about some of yours.
Well, I have to think about some of mine too. I was thinking about it this morning. So I have my grandma. I have a public figure that I admire, an author, a psychologist, my dad, my daughter. There are some people on my list. I don't have 6 people or 5 people yet, but this is a good one to think about, because what is it that you admire them for? Then you can learn about your values. The public figure that I'm talking about, I love her authenticity, her originality. She's unique. So I admire that. And I can see my values reflected in her. That freedom aspect I can see in her work. Yeah, this is a good one to think about. We're not going to express every thought we have here, but I think it's a good start.
Yeah, that is a good question. I love it. Well, this has been wonderful, Anna. I enjoyed this conversation so much. I love that you called it a juicy topic. I think that's exactly what it was. This was such a great conversation.
I know. I enjoyed it too. And this hits certain values for me, right? People, relationships, curiosity, exploring things, freedom.
It hit my learning and collaboration values too. I feel like we co-created something for me here and I loved it.
Yeah, me too. Creativity, I love it. So I hope this was helpful to the listener. Maybe I can make a PDF from all the questions and exercises so people can download and do them in a more coherent and formal way, instead of just listening to the podcast while they're walking or doing the dishes or folding laundry. And thank you so much for joining me. This was so great. This is one of my favorite parts about doing the podcast, bringing people that I resonate with, and not just I have the freedom who I can invite to the podcast. And it doesn't have to be a big shot name that I was like, woo, for me, this ordinary people like us, where the magic is, So I love that. So thank you. And I hope we can do another episode together.
Me too. Thank you very much for having me.